Hello dear friend, this is Robert Freeman and Future Procurement. We continue our episode number 48 called Best Practice, where we continue talking with Margaret Gilbert, procurement consultant, trainer and author of Contract Matters books from New Zealand. And we are discussing best practice of running quotations in procurement. Enjoy listening to this second part of our podcast episode.
Yeah. And when I did Prebid conferences, they either went brilliantly well or brilliantly awful. Brilliantly well when the supplier asked questions, and brilliantly awful if they didn't. Yeah. Because sometimes they didn't because they don't want to ask questions in front of their competitors.
Exactly.
But even if they don't say anything, it still allows you to provide what your vision is and what you're looking for, so that they are hearing that. Mm-hmm. So then they can go away and go, okay, we need to change something within our proposal response, or no, we can continue the way we are. So if we're looking at this from best practice from the supplier side, all I can do is recommend and say to suppliers, if you go along to a pre-bid conference, then listen, ask questions, and take on board what is said in terms of the specifics about what the buyer is actually saying to you, and incorporate it into your proposal response. And the concept is that if the buyer cannot answer the question on the day, is that you then say, we will come back to you within 24 hours. So that's the question and the answer out to all bidders within 24 hours.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. And honestly, it's looking in the mirror, I cannot say that it's always we were so fast answering their requests or their questions. We are so picky to them when we are beyond the deadlines, when they're submitting the bids too late or 1 hour late or whatsoever. Yes. But at the same time, let's be demanding on ourselves.
Yes. Well, this comes back to your timing schedule that you should also put into your RFP or tender document, that basically sort of gives an idea about the time frame as to how long each of the pieces within, how to do a tender process, what the time frame is, which gives the supplier knowledge as to what is occurring in the likely time frame, and of course, unless that changes dramatically, then it should be clear as.
Good recommendation.
Yeah, but the most important information that should go in from the supplier's side of things, in terms of a tender document or a RFP, for them to pay absolute attention to, and cannot be changed at all, is the closing date and time. If the closing date is, for example, I don't know, the 20th of November, let's just say, by 2 p.m., then they should be getting things in by the 20th of November before 2 p.m. Unfortunately, sometimes suppliers don't think that time frame, that little piece of information applies to them. And of course, that is rather foolish to sort of think that you can get it in after that time frame.
Yeah.
So best practice is to pay attention to what the RFP or the tender document is actually saying. I can give you an example. When I did a tender process, and when I was working in the United States, the time frame was before 2 p.m. and so people turned up and provided the proposal responses, and one person turned up at 5 o'clock and said, here is my proposal response, and I'm saying, and I've had a very bad day, and I'm saying, well, I'm about to add to your bad day because the closing date or the closing time was 2 o'clock today. So here you are 3 hours late. I cannot accept this. Exactly. So you've got to pay attention to the instructions in the RFP or tender document. This is from the supplier side, because if you can't pay attention to that simple information, then how do you think that a buyer feels whether they can trust you to follow any other sort of more difficult instructions, for example? And it has to be fair for both sides, right? It has to be fair for all suppliers. So it means that everyone has to follow the same rules. That means 20th of November by 2 p.m. Don't make it 2:05, 2:10, 2:02. I tell you, it's happened to me a lot over the years. Yeah.
But what deadline do you normally pick? Is it because before I was using Fridays when I started, but apparently Monday morning was like a better decision as I tried, or?
Oh, okay.
Because still it's this, you call it student syndrome, that everything is finalized in the last night, and always you need 1 more hour to finalize the things that you were preparing for 3 months or whatever.
Yes.
So after some time, my decision was to keep the deadline like Monday 8:00 in the morning or something like that. Because for many suppliers, it was this weekend before was like very, very helpful.
Yes.
And for me, it didn't make any difference actually, because anyway, you check it on Monday.
Yes. Well, I guess it doesn't really matter what time or day you choose. It's what you choose, and if that's what you find works best, then go for it. And I mentioned before in that example 2 p.m. Well, it could be 4 p.m., it could be 9 a.m., it could be 12 o'clock. It doesn't matter as long as you put a time frame there so they know that they have got to get in before that time frame.
True.
And 2 o'clock is often used because that allows the buyer then to distribute out to the other evaluation team members.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and go from there, rather than trying to do that at 5 o'clock, for example.
Nice.
Yeah. So the other thing of a tip for suppliers here is that if you know the time frame, and you know this, so the time frame is 3 weeks hence or 6 weeks hence, etc., whatever it is that you've got to work back to today's date, and then figure out the amount of work that has to be done, and then work to it so that you're not operating to the day. Is that because of Murphy's Law, as in what can go wrong may go wrong. Yeah. So make sure get it in early, and rather than waiting till the last minute, which is never a good place to be, because if you have to hand deliver it, for example, and if there's a crazy traffic issue or something like that, and that stops you from getting there on time, then that is an awful lot of wasted time and effort that you have done for something that's not going to be read. So it's important to get it in prior to time. Yeah, that just makes sense to me. I could never leave it to the last minute if I was trying to do something like that. I would always like to get stuff in, putting my supplier hat on now, way ahead of time, to take account of any eventuality, for example.
Yeah, good.
Yep. Alrighty, so you put your RFP out. You've got your proposal responses come in. You've evaluated the proposal responses. So let's just say you've got 9 proposal responses. Okay. You cannot interview all 9 because of time and all the rest of it. So you're most likely going to invite 4 of those 9 proposal responses, those suppliers, to come in to do a proposal presentation. Yeah. So the evaluation phase is quite simple. It's really the decision as to who goes forward and who does not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then you've got to document how your decisions were made, because sooner or later you're going to have to write something up that's what I call a recommendation for award, right, as to how you arrived at your decision. So you need to be clear about how you make your decisions. Once you've invited your suppliers to come in to do a proposal presentation, again, you really need to be clear about what you want to achieve out of that proposal presentation. So that's covering for both sides here. From the buyer side, it's whether you can make a connection. It's whether, in fact, the verbal will be basically follow up on the written, because sometimes that changes, and that always used to frustrate me, to find that I thought, yes, I've got my solution, and then find when you invite someone to come in to do a proposal presentation, they go back on what they've written, the team might have changed, or they can't make a connection with you, or they don't bother to even find out about what your organisation is about. They don't ask questions. Now, all of that is very frustrating, because what you're wanting to do is establish whether they can do the work, and whether you can, whether there is a connection there, so that when the contract is awarded and the final, whatever supplier you go with, we talked about this last time too in the last podcast about buyer-supplier relationship, you'd like to think that there would be a positive buyer-supplier relationship because that's normal, right? You want to be able to see what's possible, what can be discussed. Alrighty, so what happens after that? Once they've done, so you do 4, if you're going to interview 4, in terms of doing proposal presentations, you can only do about 4, as I said, out of the 9, and therefore you should do probably 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. This is best practice stuff. And in between those, each session, then it'd be a good idea to write notes as to how you found that presentation, because if you do not, then by the end of the day you're brain dead, you're tired, and you'll never remember who said what and when. And so it's a good idea to write notes in between each.
Yeah. So leave the time for reflection if you are in the team, especially to discuss how it was. Don't make just one after another. Good.
That's it. Because it's too hard to do it that way. Now, from the supplier side, it's very interesting because they think, and I don't know where this thinking came from, but they think that it depends on where they go in the day, whether it's first thing in the morning or second before lunch or the first time after lunch or later in the day. They think whatever it is, that there is sort of like if you're late in the day, then you're not going to have a good hearing as if you were first thing in the morning. Now, I don't know where that thinking came from, and now we've got the opportunity in this podcast to sort of give best practice stuff. The point is, doesn't matter where you come in the day, it's what you do with the time that you have.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the important thing. So you've got to be focused, and you've got to be clear about what it is that you're going to say. And you should not assume, and you should prepare before you turn up, because I've done many of these things, and you have the supplier sitting in front of you and the supplier representatives of these 3 or 4 of them arguing between themselves in front of you. Now, what sort of look is that? It's not a good look, is it? No. So from a best practice perspective, the supplier needs to plan and think about that presentation. What do they want to get across? They've only got 20 minutes effectively. So what do you want to get across? What's your key messages? You want to reinforce what you've already written, and you want to make a connection. That's an awful lot to do in 20 minutes. So arguing between yourselves is not going to be helpful.
So what is one tip that you can give also from supplier point of view? What could it be to make a pre-run, or how do you say?
Sure.
Rehearsal?
Yes, that's it. So to give you an example, if I rang a supplier today and says, would like you to come in to do a proposal presentation next Tuesday at 10 a.m., just say, that means you've got a week. You've got a week to talk to your colleagues. You've got a week to decide what you're going to say. You've got a week to be clear about who is going to be there. You want the people to be there should be the people who actually wrote that document, because, again, I've seen many times when they've just turned up and no one was there who wrote it, so no one really knows what's there, and that's not helpful either. So you've got to be clear about what it is that you're trying to do here. I know this sounds basic, and it's a worry, isn't it? But you'll be surprised the number of times that suppliers just turn up and are not prepared at all. And that's terrible.
I had not once, but it was maybe like 5 times in total when supplier was sending the professional negotiator. There is he is giving the visitor card, the visit card or business card, and it was written professional negotiator. Yes. And he is not working at this company, and I was like, I mean, this is really ridiculous. And he doesn't know the subject. He doesn't know the you said, technical things or whatever. So then when we go through quotation, everything he could say is only, let's talk about the price, and I should prove that the price is right,
Yes. So. Well, there's 2 things here. Is that, There's a difference between a proposal presentation when effectively the supplier is coming in to speak to the proposal response, and for this buyer to decide whether in fact they think it's value or not, whether for both sides to weigh each other up, I guess, in terms of whether you would like to do the work or work with these people. So there's a difference between that and being invited to come back at a later point for a negotiation. You don't want to confuse the two. They are two distinct, separate, different things and should be treated differently. Yeah. Some people try to combine it and it doesn't work, because if you're trying to establish and getting reinforcement of what is being written, so really what you're wanting to do is just sort of fronting up, being able to establish a rapport of some kind. And we're only talking about an hour here, maximum. You can't put negotiation into that mix.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what happens after that is along the lines of the buyer then decides, okay, we've now heard from 4 out of 9, and then out of those 4, who is the preference to who to negotiate with? And then obviously to then invite them to come in to do for a negotiation. Now in my neck of the woods, we don't call it negotiation because that's seen to be too scary a word.
Exactly.
We say a discussion. But suppliers who are listening to this, please take note. The words might be discussion, but it is a negotiation. Yeah, don't be fooled by the wording. And the other thing is, from a best practice perspective, is the buyer can only negotiate with one party at a time. So what happens then is that the buyer will ring the supplier, the preferred supplier in effect, and say, can you please come in, and let's just say this is a Wednesday, and please come in next Wednesday at 10 a.m. for a discussion. Okay, so for the suppliers listening, then be aware that you've got a week to prepare. Just like you had a week to prepare for the presentation, you've now got a week to prepare for the negotiation. And my neck of the woods, we are very casual about negotiation. We don't plan for it. We don't think about it. We turn up on the day and think we can do it on the day, and that's hopeless. So having written a book on negotiation, which is Contract Matters Negotiation, and we're going to be doing another podcast on negotiation, so I won't cover it too much detail now, but primarily is that you've got to be clear about what it is that you want to achieve out of the negotiation, and you've actually got to plan for that negotiation, right? You've actually got to work out, and 80% of that end result will come about before you even sit across the table from somebody. Exactly. You got to put in the work. So I've been tipping and throwing between buyer and supplier, but that equally applies for both sides. Both parties need to work out what it is that they want to achieve out of that negotiation. There could be different things. That's why you actually you have to think not just about your side of the fence, but you have to think about the other side of the fence. All useful to know. And of course, what happens after that when you once you've decided as to if the negotiation goes well and you go, okay, well, we think we can work with these people, the price is right, and of course negotiation is not always about price, and so then the decision is made, as I said, to write up a recommendation for award, as in how you've arrived at the decision, and which then gets sent to your management, of course, to keep them in the loop. And then the buyer gets in touch and says, we wish to enter into a contract with you. So that is basically the RFP or tender process. There isn't much difference between the two. So, but I think it's useful for the supplier to understand that there is a minor difference between the RFP and the tender document, which we talked about at the beginning of this podcast in terms of an RFP allows you to provide an alternative to the original scope of work. But they also should be aware that when it comes to the tender, is that you pretty much have to respond as per the scope of work. However, I've been noticing of late is that some tenders are actually sort of saying very similar to what the RFP document is saying by saying, we welcome alternative solutions. Now, if the tender document says we welcome alternative solutions, then the supplier is welcome to put in a, similar to an RFP, put in a proposal response that has a multiple solution. So from the best practice perspective, you know that you've achieved what you want to achieve when your outcomes are met, your solutions are met, and that you've documented your reasoning as to how you've arrived at the decision. Because especially within the government environment, government agency environment, you want to document this thing to death so that if there's any questions that parliamentarians might get asked in Parliament, if ever if that happens, and it happens reasonably a lot, is that it'll get kicked back to the chief executive, who'll kick it back to your procurement person. So it's a good idea to have your reasoning as to how you arrived at the decision.
I like it, yes.
The same thing applies in terms of local government, but that sort of won't be a politician. It will be a local body councillor or somebody like that, right? Or the mayor, because the mayor does not want to be embarrassed, right? So they will kick it back as well. So it's always important to be able to prove how you arrived at the decision, especially if it's high risk, especially if it's highly technical, especially if, it's high expenditure.
Yeah.
All of that is important to make sure that you've documented this thing.
So make it written, take a proper time, because this is, and I'm again looking in the mirror now.
Yes.
This is something where you don't have enthusiasm anymore, and you think that things are done, but things are not done unless you really
dotted
awarded
the I's and
contract.
crossed the T's.
Exactly.
Yes. And of course, out of all of this, at the end of this, of course, is that when you do an RFP and all tender process, is that there's a contract at the end of it. You award the contract to a supplier. Yeah. So that is basically, I think, hopefully covered off the whole RFP tender process in terms of best practice. So, and the last 3 points that I could say are this, is plan early. I know I said this before, but it's important. Plan early and educate your internal people so that they won't come to you saying, I want this tomorrow, when you know very well it's going to take ages. And make sure that your documentation is clear and concise and it's not repetitive, and it provides an option for the prospective suppliers to provide alternative solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
So from the supplier side, covering this off in terms of best practice, make a decision as to whether you, in fact, respond or not. And sometimes the best decision is not to respond. But if you do respond, make sure that you answer all the questions, because, it's very frustrating when you put out a tender document or an RFP document and you don't get what you want from the supplier. So answer all the questions, not just the half questions, and provide the technical and the commercial information, because suppliers are very good at providing the technical information. They're not always great at providing the commercial information.
Exactly.
And buyers want to see both. So I hope that's sort of provides some best practice on this subject.
I think it was great, both stepwise you reviewed, but also you have given a bunch of good tips actually on each of the stage.
Yep.
And also for our listeners, pay attention to both suppliers and buyers' perspective on this process, because being a little bit more empathetical can help sometimes. Indeed. And it's good, Margaret, that you have given the both perspectives in your overview.
All right. Well, I'm a believer in that it's important for both sides to understand each other. And to be frank, I don't think both sides understand each other at all. And I don't know why that should be in 2017, frankly, that either side doesn't understand the other. And so therefore doing what we've just been doing is really giving an understanding of, the steps along the way and what both sides need to think about, and to understand that the buyer is looking to find the best supplier. And the supplier in this situation needs to understand what the tender process or the RFP process is about, because there's an awful lot of confusion as around that subject.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this time, for your overview of the process and for your good tips and for best practice that you have shared with us, Margaret. We'll talk to you then in next podcast episode on the next topic. And this topic will be negotiations. Yep. So we will dive deep in negotiations, again wearing these two hats. So really looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Margaret, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us till the end of this episode. I really hope you have got a lot of value from these two parts of this best practice episode. Thanks to Margaret Gilbert from New Zealand, we understood the processes of quotations and procurement in a much better way. And once again, I remind you to check the books called Contract Matters, written by Margaret Gilbert. I will leave the link in the show description. And also please pay attention that in the show notes to this episode we have the link to download the report from Deloitte on Global Chief Procurement Officer Survey 2017. Just click the link to get the report. We continue changing the world using future procurement and using best procurement practices. My name is Robert Freeman and this was Future Procurement Podcast. Talk to you soon.